Let's get that going. All right, so for our last exam, we've got basically two systems that we're covering. So we're doing endocrine system and we're doing reproductive systems with a little bit of development thrown in there at the end, right? So I am entirely open to whatever you would like to do to help you get ready for that exam. Remember that this week, as you're looking through your grades and things you've submitted, etc., make sure there's no holes within your submitted grades. Make sure that you've done your extra credit up to date, right? 3 opportunities for extra credit. If you're missing one or you can't find something for one of them, just email me and let me know. And I mean, even attending an MCC event like getting free breakfast after lecture, that would count, right? It's going to be in the lobby in just a short bit. So make sure that you've done all the extra credit. I mean, it's optional, but I don't see why you wouldn't, because you never know exactly where you're going to end up. And if you end up at like a 89.3% or something like that, technically that's a B. And with extra credit, that could be an A. So why not, right? So it's always good to have a little extra cushion in there. So yeah, exam 4 coming up, final coming up. The study questions, the practice questions for the final are available already, where you usually find your practice lab practical questions under quizzes. So you can be going through those, practice, round and round and round. They are administered through Respondus Lockdown Browser because, as we were talking about, they are banks of questions that will be used for the final 2. So you do have to log into Lockdown Browser to take it, and then Lockdown Browser again to kind of take it again and stuff like that. So it's a little bit of a hassle, but at least you have questions. You have B questions. So all you got to do is keep going through them, and really that final should be fairly easy. And like I said, you're welcome to do that early. It's due Thursday, but you're welcome to do it before then. And as soon as things come in, then I'll be grading them. So if you do need grades a little bit earlier, like officially submitted or something like that, because you're applying to a program or something like that, you can let me know. And I can get that done as soon as you're done. Yeah, so entirely open, usual type of thing. We can go over exam objective questions, whether they be ones that are highlighted for short answer questions or not. We can go over, just look through the PowerPoints to remind ourselves of topics that we discussed in those systems and chapters. We can look through some example multiple choice questions that get us thinking. And of course, we can just go straight into questions that you have, like, ooh, can we go over this because you mentioned it, but I don't really get it still. We can definitely do that too. So what do you think? Are there any questions right off the bat where you're like, ooh, I was just waiting for my opportunity to ask? Let's wait for those pregnant pauses, which is a good term since we're in that last development section anyway.
Are there like mock questions for this one as well?
Mock questions like that?
Yes.
Yeah. So we can take a look at some of those. So how about this one? This one says, which of the following is true of the endocrine system but not of the nervous system? So not of the nervous system. So these are 2 control systems. They got some overlap, right, in terms of how they do things and that they coordinate activities and things like that, but there certainly can be some differences too, right, because we've got 2 systems rather than 1, so there's got to be some differences. Now, of course, with the A and B and C and stuff like that, it's probably a little bit harder than I would ask you on the exam itself, but it gets you to look at each of those answers and say, oh, is that one true? Is this one true as well? So what do we think about answer C, regulates activities of muscles and glands? Does one do that? Do they both do that? So nervous system, like when we were talking about 201 and things like that, so long ago. Nervous system definitely does that, right? We have neuromuscular junction. We have motor neurons that go out to skeletal muscle, goes bzz, bzz, releases neurotransmitter onto it, gets it to contract. Neurons communicating with neurons, neurons communicating with cells and glands and stuff like that, whether it's autonomic, whether it's somatic, etc. So definitely they do that. But hormonal does that too, right? So we have oxytocin. Where does oxytocin come from, by the way? That's posterior pituitary, right? So definitely in your time, as you are reviewing endocrine, you should have a pile of flashcards that has to do with name the hormone on the front, where it comes from specifically on the back, and then target tissues or organs and how they respond on the back as well, okay? So oxytocin coming from the posterior pituitary, also known as neurohypophysis, which you should recognize, but you don't have to necessarily use that term. And that stimulates muscle contraction, right? Smooth muscle contraction in the uterus. All right, so they both do C. How about B? Communicates via chemical signals, like chemical messages. Is that nervous system? You're like, neurotransmitters. Those are chemical signals, right? So yeah, it's nervous system, and it's definitely endocrine system as well. Hormones going into the bloodstream, chemical messages. So B and C, true. A is probably the question. So A is more so endocrine rather than nervous, right? Longer term things, because these are being cast into the bloodstream, they're circulating around. There's a period of time that they're just going to be going around, lighting up the organs that have the right receptors until they get filtered out or broken down by enzymes or just kind of diffuse out of the areas where they're going to have an effect, right? So I would say basically A for that one would be correct, because both B and C, they do those things. How about this one? This one's simpler. Whew, that one's so tough. Which of the following is not an endocrine gland? One of these things is not like the other.
C.
C, right? So C, sudoriferous gland. What is that? You're like, I don't know, I just recognize the other ones are, and that one is not like the others. Sweat gland. So it's sweat gland, right? So that is exocrine versus endocrine. So one of the first things we reviewed when we got into endocrine was exocrine glands release into a duct into the local area, right? Like in the digestive system or something like that, right? It goes right next door to it. Whereas endocrine release their secretion as a hormone into the bloodstream, which goes generally long distances instead. How about this one? Which of the following does not contain endocrine tissue? Now this one, we don't have a lot of detailed questions about those organs of other systems that primarily have a function in the other system but does release hormones. So we wouldn't have a lot of questions on that. But we definitely talked about hypothalamus, right? Hypothalamus, that's a big one because it has this relationship with the pituitary gland, both the anterior and the posterior, and that's a big topic, right? Because we have so many hormones that come from the pituitary gland, that makes it important, and hypothalamus, in essence, controls all of those. So hypothalamus for sure. Thymus has it as well, because it puts out a hormone that works to control T-cell production. Heart does as well, because it puts out a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide that helps to control blood pressure and sodium levels and things like that. Kidney does, because it puts out renin and erythropoietin to help control blood production, blood cell production, red blood cells, etc., and blood pressure, but gallbladder doesn't. How about this one? So this is talking about lipid-soluble hormones. So right there, that targets that big topic as well, where we discuss the two chemical classes of hormones. Like, what are they made from? How are they transported in the blood? Where are the receptors found for those? And then some examples of both lipid-soluble. What's the other category?
Water-soluble.
Water-soluble, right? So lipid-soluble hormones. Each of the following is a lipid-soluble hormone, except So right off the bat, one of the main kind of things to help you remember we have lipid-soluble hormones is most of those lipid-soluble hormones are going to be the ones made from cholesterol, right? So we need to know what those two chemical classes of hormones are made from. Most of the lipid-soluble hormones are made from cholesterol, and then we have different functional groups that attach to it. All of those, almost all of those that are made from cholesterol, they end in "-one", right? Testosterone, aldosterone, progesterone, corticosterone, etc. So that's that one. Estrogen is also a sex hormone like progesterone, so those go hand in hand. So that's also a lipid-soluble hormone. Aldosterone, thyroid hormone. So that one is lipid-soluble. That's like the exception to the rule, right? There's always an exception to the rule. Thyroid hormone is lipid-soluble, but it's not made from cholesterol. Okay, but it is able to get through plasma membranes and stuff like that just by its nature of being nonpolar. So thyroid hormone is lipid-soluble as well, so that leaves insulin. So insulin would be, and even glucagon, things like that, are some good examples of amino acid-based hormones that are going to be water-soluble instead. And there's a few others, right? But, yeah.
Insulin is injected subcutaneously, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
what I thought. So why wouldn't you inject insulin into the bloodstream if it's not lipid-soluble?
That's a good question. I think one of the aspects of it is that if you're doing self-injection, it takes a bit of training, and even those with training don't necessarily get it right, to put it into a vessel, to put it into a vein, right? So you got to search for it, you got to be tying it off, stuff like that. Much easier, just go bump and put it in there like that. So if it's able to absorb within those blood vessels that we have just kind of underneath the skin and things like that and absorb into those tissues, that's much easier. That's my guess, is that's just easier to put it right in the abdomen like that. Yeah. Okay, so as I mentioned, that's a bigger topic. So when we talk about those two chemical classes of hormones, like we said, we want to make sure we know those two. We want to make sure that we know what they're made from, as we were just discussing. And then the other things or ways that we want to compare them is how are they transported in the blood. So water-soluble hormones, not a problem at all, right? They're floating along the plasma just as is, whereas lipid-soluble hormones have to have a protein transport molecule, right? They have to have a carrier protein to escort them through that plasma, through that water-based plasma. Then, the other thing we want to do when we're comparing those is talking about, okay, when they get to the target cell, where's the receptor located? So for lipid-soluble hormones, it's actually inside of the cell, inside of the nucleus. So it goes through the plasma membrane, not a problem. Lipids and lipids, lipid-soluble, right? Goes through the nuclear membrane, because that's also a membrane, right? And the receptors are associated with the DNA. So that's for lipid-soluble. Water-soluble ones can't get through the lipid bilayer. So receptors are right on the surface of the cell. Okay, so that's where those receptors are located. A small topic related to that is we talked about this second messenger system that can work to amplify the signal as well. So that amplification of a hormonal signal occurs with water-soluble hormones because we have all of these domino effects in terms of different enzymes and proteins that will then end up not only transporting that message inside the cell, but amplifying it, right? Where we can get a lot of response by that cell. And then finally, like we mentioned, having some examples of water-soluble and lipid-soluble hormones. And because we're learning all of the functions of the hormones, you should be able to say, okay, what does epinephrine do? What does, well, melatonin do? Things like that, right? Okay. So this is another bigger topic towards the beginning of endocrine system. How is hormone secretion controlled or regulated? How does an endocrine gland know when it's time to release its hormone, or even when it's time to stop? What do we think about that one? E's pretty good. So first one, A would be nervous control. So what's an example, if we were talking about those, what's an example of nervous control? Where we have neurons going to an endocrine gland and going bzz, 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 and telling it when to release its hormone. That one's a little bit tougher than humoral and stuff like that, or hormonal, which is the next one. So for that one, your main examples of nervous control, one of your main examples is the adrenal medulla, because that is kind of a modified part of the sympathetic nervous system. So you have a sympathetic preganglionic cell or neuron going all the way down to the inside of the adrenal gland and releasing neurotransmitter on it, telling it when to release its epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that's your main example. You can also count the posterior part of the pituitary gland, because that's neural, right? So you have neurons in the hypothalamus going down into the posterior pituitary and releasing their hormones. So it's neural in that way as well, okay? So those are some examples of that one. Second one would be hormonal. And there are many examples of that because the pituitary gland puts out a bunch of what are called tropic hormones, which are the ones that go to other endocrine glands and say, up, now it's time for you to put yours out, right? Thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone for the adrenal cortex, things like that, right? Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, which are also important when we were learning the coordination of cycles, reproductive cycles and stuff like that, and gametogenesis. Those are tropic hormones as well, because they're going down to the gonads, which count as an endocrine gland, right? So lots of examples of hormonal control. And then the last one is humoral control. C would be humoral control. Humor is a fluid, and so there's some, like those that regulate glucose, those that regulate calcium, those are monitoring the blood, right? So insulin, glucagon, those would count for that as an example. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin also would count as examples for humoral, where we're monitoring the blood. How's the level of that particular ion? Is it high? Is it low? Do we need to adjust it? So we'll release a hormone to do that. All right, a little bit more specific to a hormone. That one, if you remember, is antidiuretic hormone. So what do you think about that? Basically, what are the actions of antidiuretic hormone? And the first one says, is it also known as vasopressin? Is that an alternate name for it? Yeah, right? Because it acts as a vasoconstrictor. The main thing is it's getting us to retain fluids and increase or at least maintain blood pressure. So your first one, you're like, oh, okay, helps regulate blood pressure for sure, right? Yeah. B is pretty straightforward. That's the main function that we keep talking about because we talk about aquaporins in the collecting tubule and stuff like that, and we reabsorb the water so we don't lose it. But it does have other effects as well, right? So it can affect water reabsorption, like in the digestive system. It can affect your perspiration, so you're not sweating as much. All of those things are going to help to maintain blood pressure. So that would be a good E for that one. This one, I wouldn't worry. I wouldn't go too in detail about this one, actually. So I'll explain it, but don't worry about this one. So remember inhibin when we were talking about that, right? So of course we have our main sex hormones coming from the gonads. We need to know what those do. So estrogen and progesterone, those were pretty important when we were talking about those hormones communicating between the ovaries and the uterus, right? Controlling those different phases of the uterine cycle. So that's a big topic as well, right? Knowing the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle, the 3 phases of the uterine cycle, and the hormones that control those phases in each, right? But inhibin is a feedback hormone that comes out of both. That basically feeds back up to the hypothalamus and the pituitary because they're helping to control those gonads as well. So that one's kind of shared there. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. Now, follicle stimulating hormone, that one is a good question. So follicle stimulating hormone, is that produced by the gonads? Either the testes or the ovaries? It's not, right? Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, those are those tropic hormones that are coming from the pituitary gland and going down to the gonads and telling the gonads to do certain things, right? So the reason that I highlight that is that sometimes people get those hormones kind of confused as like where the hormone's coming from and what it's controlling. So luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone are coming from the pituitary gland, going down to either the testes or the ovaries and telling you what to do. The follicle stimulating hormone part, the names come from what it involves in the female, right, developing the follicles, but that is focusing on, in essence, gametogenesis, right? And so follicle stimulating hormone also has that name in that function, if you will, in the male reproductive system, right? It's going to stimulate spermatogenesis. Whereas luteinizing hormone, where its name comes from, is it's causing the formation of the corpus luteum. So if we eject the egg at ovulation, that's a function of luteinizing hormone. And then the development of those follicular cells into the corpus luteum, that's also a function of luteinizing hormone. So that's where the name comes from. But we know that the corpus luteum, its main role is to release progesterone, to signal the uterus to maintain its endometrial lining, right? So that's more of a hormonal type of response that we're getting from the gonad. And so luteinizing hormone also has a similar function in the testes, right? So luteinizing hormone tells those interstitial cells to release testosterone. So again, kind of a tropic type of hormone that's going down and controlling the endocrine release. Whoop. Okay. So those were a bunch of questions having to do with endocrine system, because it's been a while since we were talking about endocrine system. This one is just straightforward reproductive system. When you look at that list of terms, which one of those doesn't seem familiar in terms of the male reproductive system? That's all lab practical stuff, it's anatomy stuff. So that middle one, see there, not a male. So that's a female analog of the bulbourethral gland. So again, even if you didn't remember vestibular gland, if you go through and you're like, yep, recognize prostate gland, yep, epididymis sitting right on top of the testes, bulbourethral gland, one of the three glands when we're transporting the sperm, and of course testes, part of the male reproductive system, you would have gone with vestibular there. Talking about those bulbourethral glands, we have three different glands that are contributing to semen. They each contribute differently to support the sperm in some way. What are some characteristics here of the bulbourethral glands? Secrete an alkaline mucus. How does that seem? That seems good, right? That's their main role, is that they produce that secretion to coat the urethra, because remember, in the male, the urethra is serving urinary as well as reproductive. So we've got to coat it with this alkaline mucus because urine is often acidic instead. About the size of pears. I don't know if you know your fruits. That's pretty big, right? About the size of peas, yes. And there are two of them, that's why it's plural there. Located superior to the prostate gland. That makes you think of the anatomy. Not that either, right? Prostate gland is just inferior to the bladder. The urethra, as it exits the bladder, goes through the prostate gland. So we have three sections of the urethra in the male. Prostatic, membranous, and spongy or penile urethra, right? So if we're doing that tracing, we got to include all three of those. So if we're talking about something superior to the prostate gland, that's going to be the bladder. So that's right above it instead, right? So there are different glands as well: seminal vesicle, prostate gland, and bulbourethral glands. How about this one? Which of the following is not true of the ovaries? So are the ovaries the female gonads? Yeah, right? Gonads, primary sex organs. Do they produce gametes that are called secondary oocytes? Yeah, right? So we have primary oocytes starting off in those primordial follicles and primary follicles. Secondary oocytes, they go through their second step of meiosis and stuff like that, but it still counts. So the oocytes are what they're producing. Do they produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone? No, right? They produce estrogens and progesterone, but follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone are targeting the gonads, targeting the ovaries, right? Coming down from the pituitary. And they are homologous to the testes. They're both gonads. So that was just, again, reminding us of that topic of the coordination of the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, right? So for that, you want to be able to list, if we're talking about the ovarian cycle, on a very basic level, we've got 3 phases, right? So we have the follicular phase. We've got ovulation. And we've got the luteal phase. Right? So we have 3 phases there. So you'd have to be able to name those 3. And those are the ovary. Don't go talking about menstruation and stuff like that associated with the ovary. That doesn't happen there, right? And then we have to know what hormones. I mean, we have to be able to describe what's going on in these phases too. At least a 1-sentence description, like what's going on in the follicular phase, development of the follicles, right? Maturation of the follicles. Ovulation, egg release. Luteal phase, formation of the corpus luteum after the egg has been released. So what are the hormones that are controlling these? Follicular development is follicle stimulating hormone. Luteinizing hormone, a spike in it, so it goes up really high and then it drops. That causes ovulation or release of the egg. And then continued release of luteinizing hormone at higher levels. Make sure that the corpus luteum is maintained, created and maintained. Okay? So we have 2 hormones coming from the anterior pituitary that are controlling those 3 phases. And we have a similar type of structure in terms of the uterine cycle, in that we have 3 phases and 2 hormones that are going to control those phases. So we start off with menstruation. Then we've got the proliferative phase. Because in menstruation, we were shedding a lot of that endometrium. Now remember, endometrium, on a basic level, when we were talking about it in lab, we're just like endometrium, myometrium, perimetrium, stuff like that. But endometrium has 2 layers to it, 2 strata. Stratum basalis, which always stays, and that's what we build back from. And then we have stratum functionalis, like 90% of it that sloughs off. So stratum functionalis is being lost here, being built back there, proliferating. And then we have the secretory phase. And in the secretory phase, that's where we have a lot of secretion going on by those uterine glands in the endometrium. So this one comes from a drop in progesterone. So progesterone coming from the corpus luteum. If the corpus luteum goes away and becomes a corpus albicans, then the progesterone it was putting out is going to go down, and there's not going to be any more signal to the uterus to maintain that endometrium. So it's a drop in progesterone. Proliferative phase comes from mainly estrogen that is coming from the developing follicles. So as those follicles get bigger, primordial, primary, secondary, tertiary, or mature, those follicles are getting bigger. We have more follicular cells, like theca cells and stuff like that. So we're going to see those estrogen levels go up as those follicles get bigger. So the estrogen is what causes the proliferative phase. And then finally, the secretory phase is caused by an increase in progesterone. And that's coming from the corpus luteum. So again, we have 2 hormones that need to control and coordinate 3 phases. And so for this one, you really do have to make sure that you're talking about, these are both caused by progesterone, but this one's caused by a drop in progesterone, this one's caused by increased levels of progesterone instead. Okay? Okay. What about this one? Oogenesis. So the creation of our oocytes. What are some true things about that? Begins after puberty. How do we feel about that one? Don't do that one. Spermatogenesis, yep, right? But oogenesis, all of the oocytes you're ever going to release were made before you're born, right? So that starts early on. Is completed, oogenesis is completed only after the second oocyte has been fertilized. Yeah, that was a weird thing about it, right? So we have 2 rounds of meiosis. We're looking to see where each one of those happens. And that second round of meiosis does not complete unless that ovulated oocyte is being attacked, if you will, by a sperm cell with its acrosome and its enzymes. It's eating through those outer cell layers in order to fertilize the egg. That process gets it to kick out its last set of extra chromosomes and become that haploid cell with just 23. Okay, so that only when it becomes necessary does it finally complete meiosis. Produces 4 viable secondary oocytes from each oogonium. No. So spermatogenesis for sure. We got to make billions and billions of cells. So that process of meiotic divisions, where we go from 1 to 4, is a great way of doing that. In oogenesis, don't care as much about that because we only have to make like 500 of them. I mean, we only have to release about 500 of them. We make a few thousand-ish, right? So we have 1 functional oocyte that is made from 1 starting oogonium. When we're doing those cell divisions, remember we're kind of casting off that polar body where we're getting rid of extra genetic material and we're maintaining a lot of the cytoplasm, the cytosol, for that really big oocyte that's going to continue on. So only 1 functional cell produced. Is inhibited by follicle-stimulating hormone. Stimulated by follicle-stimulating hormone, it's right in the name, right? Produces diploid gametes. That's a reminder of those words diploid and haploid, right? Haploid, half the genetic material. A gamete should have half. Diploid is every other cell in your body, as well as some of those oogonial cells or spermatogonial cells, the stem cells that we begin with, right? So, go back to those slides to remind yourself in terms of steps of oogenesis, right? Primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, there's those polar bodies on the left there. And then we also talked about how, those are coordinated with the follicular development that we talked about inside of the ovary. And then this one is just to remind us of a similar process in terms of spermatogenesis. So remember that while in lab, we did have to know a bit about this, right? What are we seeing right here? What's this big circular thing? It's inside of the testes, coiled up, seminiferous tubule, right? So we saw seminiferous tubules inside of the testes. It's a microscope slide, could show up in the lab practical. Maybe. And it's in the walls of the seminiferous tubules where the sperm are produced. And in the lab, we simplified it to just 3 different cell types. We had spermatogonia, the stem cells along the edge. Then in the middle of the wall, we had our spermatocytes, just generic. Then when we were on the very inside by the lumen, then we had our spermatozoa or sperm cells, right, with the flagella and stuff like that. Do remember that in lecture, we have to know, again, the different stages, not only spermatogonia, but then primary and secondary spermatocytes, right? The differences between our meiosis 1 and, right, going from a primary spermatocyte where we have 1 cell to 2 cells, that's the end of meiosis 1. From secondary spermatocytes to spermatids, you can see we have 2 cells to 4 cells. That's the end of meiosis 2. That's why we have twice as many cells, okay? And now in spermatids, now we start to get that stereotypical cell shape for the sperm, okay? So for spermatogenesis, we want to be able to describe each of those stages and kind of what comes after what and what's going on. Okay. Endometrium. Is it the inner layer of the uterus? Endo means inside, yeah, endometrium, right? Endometrium, myometrium, perimetrium. Myometrium is a smooth muscle layer. Has a layer that's called stratum functionalis that sloughs off during menstruation. Yep, we said that. Has a layer called the stratum basalis that persists and gives rise to the stratum functionalis. Yep, confirms that. Highly vascular. Yep, we saw that in the microscope slides. We saw it in the figures. Most of us in here actually experience that. Us, in air quotes, right? Menstruation, a lot of blood because these blood vessels are breaking down and the tissue is breaking down. So not only are we getting blood released directly from those blood vessels, but that stratum functionalis itself is falling apart. Okay, mammary glands. Modified sebaceous glands. Lie deep to the pectoralis major muscle. Produce milk. Pretty confident with that one, right? Remember, not only with the mammary glands producing milk, remember there are a couple hormones that influence their production of milk, right? Prolactin, go milk, that's the main one. Oxytocin has an influence as well, right? Modified sebaceous glands, no, modified sweat glands, sudoriferous glands. Sebaceous glands are oil glands, if you remember. Lies deep to pectoralis major, right? Superficial on top of it, yeah. Okay, so those are just some questions kind of spanning a variety of topics to get us thinking about some of the things that we learned and some of the important things we needed to discuss. Okay. Questions that may have percolated up based on what we were looking at so far. Well, when we look at this, what we have here, when we look at our highlighted, as opposed to bold, objectives, we see some of our possible short answer questions. Now again, when we go through them here, that's a great thing because we're organizing our thoughts and stuff like that. And when you write them out, that's going to be important. Writing them out is just practice. Like, oh, okay, how am I going to phrase it? I'm going to write it out, practice spelling words and stuff like that. That's an important step. And then you got to go through that studying process, right? Why writing it out once, listening to it once or twice isn't going to get to stick in terms of, okay, there's a question, boom, 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 here's my answer. So you got to practice between now and exam 4 as well. So writing out your answers to these short answer questions, but then practicing them, having somebody ask you them, putting them on a flashcard, handing them over to somebody, and having somebody quiz you on them, going to be important some way between now and then. All right, so that first one, 6 and 7, has to do with those chemical classes. So we reviewed that, right? What are they made from? How are they transported in the blood? Where are the receptors located? And some examples of them as well. Okay, so lipid soluble and water soluble. Hypothalamus and its relationship with the pituitary gland. So that one, what we have is the anterior and the posterior. Somebody left the cap off on that one. That one's not going to work well. Anterior and the posterior pituitary, right? So for the anterior pituitary versus the posterior pituitary, those are the two parts that you need to know. The anterior is going to put out inhibiting and releasing hormones that go down and target, anterior pituitary is stimulated by those from, that's better, hypothalamus. I guess I'm too close to the board. Okay, so the hypothalamus puts out hormones. They go into little blood vessels that drop straight down from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. So what type of control is that for the anterior pituitary? It's hormonal control. That's an example of hormonal control. Hypothalamus releases hormones, whether they be inhibiting or releasing hormones. This is going to stop the anterior pituitary from secreting. That's going to tell it to start. From the hypothalamus, that's an example of hormonal control. Okay? Meanwhile, posterior pituitary, we have neurons directly from the hypothalamus. Creating and releasing, we'll just write the hormones, ADH and oxytocin. So in that way, we were saying, that's kind of an example of neural control, because these are neurons that the cell bodies of those neurons are up in the hypothalamus. Their axons go down through the infundibulum, and then the axon terminals are releasing those two hormones from the posterior pituitary. So that's why in lab, when we were filling out that table for hormones, we're like, but where are these hormones, antidiuretic and oxytocin, where are they released from and where are they created? They're created in the hypothalamus, but they are released from the posterior pituitary, okay? Remember, we have like 6 hormones from here that we have to know about, and then 2 from the posterior pituitary, okay? Okay. So from that, we get down below where we have all those different hormones that come from either the anterior or the posterior pituitary. So you need to know what those do. That's just straight flashcard stuff. Now make sure that you have a couple. We're not talking one sentence. We're not in the lab anymore. So you got to be able to describe it, 2 to 3 sentences, what those different hormones do, what the target organ is, and then how it's responding when that hormone shows up, right? Now some of them are simpler than others. Follicle-stimulating hormone, we talked about, prolactin, oxytocin, things like that. Thyroid-stimulating hormone. Some are a little bit more complex. Growth hormone, a lot of different target tissues, but you can still focus on bones, skeletal system, and muscular system, right? So the growth of those tissues under the influence of growth hormone. Okay, so that's for pituitary, and then this question has to do with our 3 types of control for hormones, right? Or for endocrine glands. Well, it's a hormonal control. So endocrine control system is basically hormonal control, humoral from the fluid like we talked about, or neural control like we've been giving examples from. So that is about endocrine control. Then we get to thyroid. So thyroid puts out 2 hormones. They come from different cells, right? So we have those different follicles in there with the colloid, the pink gelatinous stuff in there, right? And the follicular cells put out our thyroid hormone. And the parafollicular cells, which are in between the follicles, put out calcitonin instead, right? Calcitonin's an easy one. Thyroid hormone is a little bit like growth hormone in that it has many, many different target cells around the body that helps to regulate energy levels, use of energy, energy storage, metabolism, stuff like that. Okay? What else do we have there? Oh, we've got adrenal gland. Now, adrenal gland is also a bigger one. Okay? Adrenal gland, we've got 2 regions to it. We've got a cortex and a medulla, just like we learned in lab, right? Put out different hormones. But in addition, we need to know how those 2 areas of the adrenal gland are controlled, right? For instance, we saw the adrenal medulla is neural control. That's our one of our examples of neural control. For the cortex, it's generally hormonal control instead, right? So we have adrenocorticotropic hormone coming from the pituitary gland, etc., coming down to tell it. But the other thing about it that was a little bit new for lecture is that the adrenal cortex has 3 zones to it as well, right? So we had zones, adrenal cortex, cortez, that almost looks right. Zones, which were called GFR. GFR was like in the kidney, glomerular filtration rate, but here that's going to help us remember our 3 different zones that we have in the adrenal gland. So we have glomerulosa and fasciculata, and reticularis, right? And so for each of those, we have different hormones that come from them, right? So we're going to have, remember, we talked about aldosterone, we talked about corticosterone or cortisol or cortisone, and then we also talked about the fact that the inner layer, the reticularis, puts out sex hormones like androgens, right? Okay? So you need to be able to say in the adrenal cortex, we need to be able to list those 3 layers, talk about what hormone comes out of each one, and then what those hormones do, right? What does aldosterone do? What does cortisol do? Cortisol is a little bit more complex. Like we said, it's kind of a stress hormone, so it has to do with energy storage and stuff like that. And then the sex hormones, that's kind of an easier one because in the males, those androgens, like testosterone, get overwhelmed by the massive amount that's released by the testes. In the females, it may have to do with the female sexual response. It may be converted into estrogen, stuff like that. Okay? Okay, then pancreas. Pancreatic islets is what we're focusing on for pancreas, right? Rather than pancreatic acini. Two main hormones we're focusing on there, insulin and glucagon. They work antagonistically. Oh, okay, so that's a reminder. Not only, let's see, is that important in terms of, it's an example of humoral control, because that's blood sugar. So we're measuring blood sugar directly. So that's a good example of humoral control. It's also a good example of antagonistic hormones, right? So we have hormone interactions. That was one of the other things that we addressed early on in that endocrine PowerPoint or chapter, right? Is that some hormones will interact with each other, whether they work against each other like that, whether they work synergistically, or whether there's a permissive effect, where the presence of one kind of gives permission for the other to have an additional effect, okay? So make sure that you review that as well. So that was pancreas, and there's parathyroid glands. Parathyroid gland putting out parathyroid hormone, that's an easy one. That is humorally controlled, because that's calcium. Remember that with that one, and anytime you say, right, particularly for calcium, for glucose, okay, don't just say controls calcium levels or controls glucose levels. That's too generic. Number one, we got to say, okay, controls, does that go up or does it go down? Because it's specific, right? Those hormones have opposite effects. So one of them is going to make it go up, the other one's going to make it go down. So you got to say that. Which way is it going? And you need to give me a target tissue or a target organ. Where is it going up? Where is it going down, right? Mostly we're focusing on the blood because it's humoral. So increasing blood calcium levels or whatever, right? You got to be able to say that. And then if that's the response, what are the organs? So for like calcium and stuff like that, it's definitely going to involve the bones, right? Osteoclasts, chewing up bones, stuff like that. But it also involves like the intestine as well as the kidneys, because the kidneys can reabsorb or secrete, as we noticed from back before. Okay? So you got to make sure you're specific in terms of what that hormone does and what's the target cell or target organ that's responding to it, right? Okay. Then reproductive system. So a few things in reproductive system. Number one, we need to know the different organs and what each one contributes. Okay? Number two, we need to be able to talk about gametogenesis. How does spermatogenesis occur? What are each of the steps and stuff like that? How does oogenesis occur? What are each of the steps in terms of those meiotic divisions and what we produce? Okay? So those are some bigger topics. We need to know the hormones, the sex hormones. That's where we focus more on those sex hormones. So what does follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone do in either the male or the female gonads? And how are they responding? What do their sex hormones do? What does testosterone do? What does estrogen do? What does progesterone do? Okay? And then finally, we also needed to understand, so there are those things, oogenesis, hormonal control. We also wanted to be able to do tracings. So the tracings, the last couple of things that we see right there, have to do with tracing. Did we diagram those on the board yet? Did we do one of those? We didn't do either of them?
We did.
We did?
Sperm.
Sperm, right, yeah. Okay. So for that one, for traveling of sperm, that one is going to be, right, where are the sperm going to be created? In the testes, right? So in the testes, you could put seminiferous tubules because that's actually in the testes where they do. So from there, we go to the epididymis on top. We go to the vas deferens, going around the sides of the bladder. As we get to the ejaculatory duct, that's where the seminal vesicle dumps in. When we get to the prostatic urethra, obviously that's where the prostate dumps in. Then there's the membranous urethra, where it's exiting the body cavity. Then right about there is where the bulbourethral glands dump in, and then we have the penile or the spongy urethra that goes out. Okay? So that was the same tracing. For the tracing for the female, that's going to be a bit shorter, right? The urethra is shorter and stuff like that. The urethra is not even used right? When we were doing urinary tracings, we did a comparison of urethra and through the kidney and stuff like that. But in the female reproductive system, we're going to be talking about that oocyte coming from the ovary. It's going to be picked up by those finger-like structures that are called the fimbriae. That's going to go to the uterine tube, which is going to conduct it down to the uterus itself. Technically, there are areas to the uterus, remember that, right? So there's the fundus, the upper curved area. There's the body, the main chamber of it. There's the isthmus as it narrows down. But it's all right if you put uterus in this tracing. The opening from the uterus is going to be the cervix, and then the cervix is going to open down into the vagina, right? So when that oocyte is released, it's going to take that full path ultimately out. Now, of course, if it was fertilized along the way, it's going to be turned into a zygote and a morula and a blastula and an embryo and stuff like that, and an embryo and a fetus, and then the fetus is ultimately going to take that same path out, right? So it still makes it out. It's just a bit more complex in that case, right? So that would be your tracing in terms of the oocyte from where it's created until it exits the body. Okay? Other things. So remember, next week, or whenever you are taking, if you're taking those last assessments, exam 4 and the final, of course, respondus, closed book, closed notes, all that type of thing. Make sure that you're in a calm testing environment, right, as much as possible. Let people in your house know that you're going to be busy. You are unavailable. Mom doesn't exist for that hour and a half, right, if at all possible. And if anything happens, just let me know, right? Send me an email. You lost your internet connection, or somebody walked through, or the dog threw up. I've had that. It's okay. Just put a towel over it. When you're taking those, make sure that everything's ready, and your computer's ready and stuff like that. Next week, for this class, no meetings, right? This is our last time together. I mean, later lab people, we're going next door, right? But not coming to campus for this class next week, okay? I'll be here on Monday. I'll be here on Monday for regular office hours. I'll probably be here earlier than that as well. So if you want to come see me on Monday, I'll be available to go through things as well when exam 4, or prior to exam 4. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I'll be available during office hours, but I'll be online through Cranium Cafe, so I won't be physically here. But I'll still be available, and I'll be available by email as well, right? So if you're going through your exam objectives and you typed it all out, you're like, hey, how's this? Is that good? Do I need anything else in this? I can double check things, give you feedback, send it back to you, and then study, right? So if you need help, I'm around between now and whenever you take your last exam. Okay? Any other things? Because I want to leave a little bit extra time for those that have to take the lab practical still. And I wanted you guys to have available time to go out and get free breakfast outside too. Because administration and the Office of Student Life have the breakfast. Now it should be open. I saw a Belgian waffle bar, and I think there were breakfast burritos and fruit cups and all kinds of drinks and stuff like that. So make sure you go get that. There's still more fudge and candy canes at the back there that you can grab as well. And so for morning lab people, best of luck. Let me know how I can help. For later lab people, still best of luck, but I'm going to see you in a little bit. Okay?